in the WUIs of the American West are culturally, politically, economically diverse, and they have varying capacities to mitigate wildfire risk. In short, not all WUI neighborhoods are full of McMansions, although this picture on the right of the Colorado Springs WUI, some homes that burned down during the Waldo Canyon fire, certainly fit into that McMansion category. This picture here on the left of a smaller cabin that burned down during the High Park fire outside of Fort Collins does not. Now that said, all WUIs do share at least one thing, and that's wildfire risk. The question of whether wildfires are growing bigger or not is subject of some scientific debate, and we're not going to be going into that today. But whether you think fires are getting bigger in the WUI or not, the development of the WUI certainly is growing. And as more houses are built and density increases, the hazards and costs associated with wildfires in the WUI increase. Now, Colorado, unfortunately, is an excellent case study in this dynamic. Colorado's Front Range is a major high-risk WUI area, and it continues to grow at a really high pace. Now, there's significant costs associated with wildfire, costs in terms of loss of life, loss of property, firefighting expenditures, and also damage to infrastructure, especially to water resources infrastructure. After the 2002 Hayman fire, for example, Denver Water had to spend $26 million dredging their reservoirs of sediment and debris and doing other, larger watershed restoration projects. So one way to address these hazards and their significant costs is to proactively mitigate for wildfire risk on the front end. Thinning trees in the WUI and otherwise working to protect structures and infrastructure from fire. Now, as a society, unfortunately, we're not particularly good at dedicating resources to wildfire prevention. We're so bad at this, in fact, that resource managers have a term, wildfire borrowing, that they use to describe the persistent sort of pilfering of wildfire prevention funds for the purpose of fighting wildfires themselves. So resource managers, as you can imagine, are not too excited about that habit. I'm quoting a top Colorado emergency official down here at the bottom of this story, which was published in the Post about a month ago, and he says, "We end up robbing from the land managers. We end up stealing from those prevention programs to fight fires." So wildfire prevention itself is a complicated thing, and it's complicated because at the heart of the WUI, we have a big collective action problem. If you live in the WUI, your individual incentives don't necessarily compel you to act collectively to reduce wildfire risk on your property, in your neighborhood, in your community. Thinning trees and making structural changes is incredibly expensive, time-intensive, and difficult. As an individual, therefore, it's easier for you to free ride on others' wildfire risk mitigation efforts, to wait to be rescued by government firefighting efforts, or to externalize the costs of wildfire risk through insurance or disaster assistance. Now, these dynamics lead to some real governance challenges, and among them is the reality that the top-down regulation of risk mitigation isn't really feasible, either from a political or a logistical standpoint. So as a result, resource managers have to turn to incentives or sanctions that might convince people to act collectively to reduce risk. Further complicating this collective action problem is the complexity of the WUI itself. We know that fire doesn't heed the political, scalar, jurisdictional boundaries that we humans like to establish to organize our work and our policies. So those that aim to reduce wildfire risk have to work at a lot of different scales, from individual lots all the way up to national forests. They also have to navigate a patchwork of public and private land, as well as a cast of different characters, everybody from local, state, federal entities to private and non-governmental entities that might play overlapping, conflicting, but hopefully complementary roles in terms of mitigating wildfire risk. So all these complexities really motivate our research questions, the questions that have been guiding the work we've been doing. We have a number of questions. I've kind of condensed them all into one for the purposes of this presentation, and that's this. It's what is and what isn't working in terms of communicating wildfire risk and promoting wildfire mitigation on private property across the WUI. The emphasis here is on private property because we're focused on residential WUI areas and the individuals, neighborhoods, and communities within them. We know at the end of the day that resource managers are working with really limited resources for wildfire prevention. So our ultimate goal is to kind of identify what's the biggest bang for sort of resource managers' buck? What's turning out to be really successful? So I'm going to hand it off to Elizabeth here, who's going to talk about our research design and then start diving into the results. All right, thanks, Adrienne. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods that we use to collect data in order to answer some of these questions. And we kind of approached the study over the past year with a mixed method approach. And the first part of that mixed method approach is our qualitative data, which really came from 2 in-depth case studies. Both of these case studies were in Colorado. They were in 2012. Very similar times, as I'll talk about in a minute. They caused catastrophic damage in the communities in which they burned, and I'm going to go from there. Won't get into too many more details. So the first wildfire in our case studies is the High Park Fire. This happened in the WUI outside of the Fort Collins area. It burned over 87,000 acres and 259 homes. At the time, it was the 3rd largest wildfire per area, or by area, in the state of Colorado. Just 3 weeks later, however, the Waldo Canyon Fire happened outside the WUI in Colorado Springs. And as you can see here, this wildfire burned a lot less acreage, but it burned a lot more homes. And part of the reason for that is really harkening back to the importance of looking at the different characteristics of the WUI. So outside of Fort Collins, the WUI is not even actually in Fort Collins. It's more in the Bellevue area, Rift Canyon, Poudre Canyon, those kind of things. Whereas in Colorado Springs, 24% of the WUI is right in the urban and suburban area. So we really see some different effects on the types of catastrophic damage that these wildfires are doing. And in both of our case study communities, we collected a series of interviews with fire managers at all different levels, leaders of watershed groups involved in wildfire risk mitigation, which is kind of our new direction that we're going for this current conference. And then we conducted focus groups with WUI residents. And these were all residents that were affected by wildfire. Some of them had actually had their homes burned down. Others had experienced close calls and things like that. And so through these 2 case studies, we really got a lot of depth on what kinds of practices are happening in wildfire mitigation, what kinds of things are people thinking about mitigation on the ground. But we wanted to go ahead and expand this and test some of our initial findings in a broader space. So we also created a survey, which is the quantitative side of our data. And this survey surveyed wildfire professionals in 10 states across the western U.S. And the way we contacted these wildfire professionals is we looked at initially type 1 fires across the western U.S. So Fort Collins and Colorado Springs, both the 2 fires that I just talked about, they were type 1 fires as well. A type 1 fire is kind of the most catastrophic fire. It has over 1,000 professionals responding to that fire. It has air support, all sorts of things. So very high-level catastrophic fire. So we started looking at type 1 fires that happened in these states in 2012 or later. And we found contact information for fire managers that had jurisdiction in these fires, whether it was kind of at the federal level, the state level, the local level. We also eventually expanded this out to type 2 fires, which are also still very catastrophic, in order to get kind of a bigger sample of people working in wildfire. And out of the 499 surveys we sent out, we received 132 completed surveys for a response rate of 26.5%. So I am going to move into talking a little bit about our findings next, or at least the first section of our findings. But before I do that, I just want to comment a little bit on how we're kind of piecing together these quantitative and qualitative sets of data. So a couple things we're doing. Using our survey, we're really looking at what resource managers are doing versus what they think works best and what they think residents are most receptive to. We could ask them questions about these kind of things. But we can really use our qualitative data to then cross-check kind of what residents' perceptions are against what fire managers are reporting. We want to know what resource managers aren't doing that our residents and NGOs found successful, and then diving a little bit more into the role of those NGOs and how they can work across jurisdictions. So these 2 data sets in combination really help us better answer these questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about our findings now. So in our survey, we first asked our respondents if they dealt with wildfire response or mitigation, and the vast majority, only a few, said they didn't. So out of those that said they did, we had 73% say that mitigation was either within their agency's mission or central to their agency's mission. So we have a pretty educated sample of people who work kind of almost every day with these mitigation activities. And not only did we want to know how often they work with mitigation, but we wanted to know what types of mitigation they promote. So some of the types that we found, over 60% of our sample said they promote mitigation through fuels reduction, which is thinning trees, cutting trees down on properties, things like that. A good portion, over 50%, said they promoted mitigation through home defense. So things like cleaning out your gutters, raking pine needles, those kind of things. And then finally, a smaller percentage, about 28%, said that they promoted structural mitigation. So this is kind of changing your roofing material or installing fire-resistant siding on your house. So this gives a little bit of background on who the kind of people are that took our survey and are answering our questions. And actually, one more thing I wanted to mention about that as well. When we asked them about these types of mitigation that they use, we also asked them where they use those types of mitigation. So we had about a 50-50 split that worked within kind of a closer perimeter to homes, between 10 and 30 feet from a home. And then we also had our other half that worked greater than 50 feet. So we are seeing kind of mitigation property-wide as well. So a pretty diverse sample of mitigation professionals or fire professionals. All right, so we know our fire managers are doing mitigation. We know what kind of mitigation they're promoting. We want to know how they're promoting this mitigation to citizens. So we asked them a series of questions. We asked them to rank some different, or actually rate, I should say, a 1 to 5 scale, some different ways that they could get information to residents about wildfire mitigation. And 42% of our sample ranked outreach and education as kind of their #1 way to talk about mitigation to other people. So we saw that they're kind of going for a little bit more of those informal methods, and fewer fire professionals are going for formal methods of getting wildfire mitigation information out. So things like taxes or fees, encouraging someone to mitigate through putting a tax on them, or an ordinance on construction. Only 13% of our sample said that they would do that first, whereas 42% really said, we would like to get mitigation happening through outreach and education, these little bit more informal efforts. To dive into some of the things that they didn't think were important, we wanted to know why. Why didn't they think that putting an ordinance on a property would be less helpful in promoting wildfire mitigation? And this is where we really got to talk to our focus group residents. We heard that ordinances, it's really politically infeasible to create an ordinance that applies to pre-existing structures. And in places like Colorado Springs, where there's only 8% of the hillside that's left to be built on, an ordinance isn't going to be very effective because it can't govern most of the property that's there already. As far as taxes, that was kind of a non-starter with our focus groups. They didn't even want to talk about it. And even when taxes were put in the best light, something like a tax reduction, they were still really skeptical. So they were saying, even if we get a tax reduction for mitigating, most likely the tax reduction won't even cover what you're going to end up paying. So fire professionals are kind of tapping into these attitudes and showing that they're preferring a little bit more informal efforts to get mitigation information out. All right, so digging into this further, if fire professionals prefer outreach and education as a way to get people to mitigate instead of kind of forcing them to mitigate through ordinances or something like that, we wanted to know what they do. How do they outreach and educate citizens? So we looked at, along the x-axis, we have a number of different types of outreach and education approaches. And we asked both whether they use these approaches. So the blue bars are firefighter or wildfire professionals that say they use these often. So it's the percentage of how many use them often, and what they think is effective as well. So just a quick rundown of these. Public meetings are things like the head of an HOA bringing a fire marshal into a meeting in their community who can really talk to residents kind of as a group about mitigating. Community events are things more like fire fairs or barbecues, where it's kind of an informal mixing of wildfire professionals and citizens. Face-to-face individual contact is having a fire professional come to your house, talk to you about your property, and decide kind of a plan for mitigating. Literature and brochures, website information, obvious, kind of the passive side of outreach and education. Citizen-to-citizen networks, really interesting. It's kind of when we either have a small fire agency or even up to a larger fire agency kind of capitalize on a really motivated citizen who can go out and talk to other citizens about mitigating. And Colorado Springs has really institutionalized this practice, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then finally, community fire planning is the process really of writing fire plans for your community that prioritize the actions you're going to take or prioritize perhaps what structures you want to preferentially mitigate wildfire against. So we saw this most in these plans, community wildfire protection plans, or CWPPs, that also allow communities to get grant money from federal and state entities for mitigating in their communities. So a quick rundown of kind of what's important here. All of these are ranked as pretty highly effective. You know, they're all ranked more than, 68% effective by fire professionals. So what we kind of glean from this is that fire professionals see getting some information out to residents as more important than not getting any information out to residents. And that all of these things really do have a role to play and can kind of reach different audiences. However, when we look a little bit more closely, we see that face-to-face individual contact was ranked much higher than the rest of the approaches. And that fire professionals really saw this as being most effective and community wildfire planning as second most effective. The things that they do often, however, literature and brochures and website information, the two things that they rank that they do most often, they report as being least effective, which we find really interesting. And for us, this kind of signals a resource constraint. So it's easy to put information on a website. It's fairly easy to create a brochure. It's less easy to spend hours going out to subdivisions and talking to everyone face-to-face about mitigating on their property. All right. And I guess the final comment I wanted to make about this graph as well is that some of this matches up really well with the information we got in our qualitative data and other parts don't. So just to point out a couple disparities, fire professionals rated public meetings as pretty highly effective. 80% of our respondents said that they were very effective. Our citizens did not feel that way, and they said it was just because people simply don't attend public meetings. They're not actually motivated to go. Citizen-to-citizen networks, maybe not ranked as high, 78% around there. We heard that these were actually incredibly effective from our citizens, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So this paints kind of a general picture, but when the rubber hits the road and our fire professionals are forced to rank number one, if they could only do one strategy, what would they do? We see this play out a little bit more clearly. So we see that things like literature, brochures, website content, only 8% of fire professionals say, you know, if I only had one thing I could do, I would do that. Pretty small number. 44% go with this kind of face-to-face individual contact approach to outreach and education. We also added a category of residents' personal experiences. And what we really mean by that is helping residents learn from either their own personal experience or the personal experiences of others. So we heard things from people in our focus group, such as when the Hayman burn in 2002 occurred, interest spiked in mitigating, even though all we were doing was smelling the burn. We heard people say, you know, I was able to see flames, or I heard about my neighbor becoming evacuated, and this really motivated me to mitigate. However, we know our fire professionals don't necessarily want everyone to have a personal experience with wildfire. That's what we're trying to avoid by creating prevention mechanisms. So face-to-face contact kind of comes in as a second best option to that. And this was from our Fort Collins focus group. We had a fire professional who I chatted with, and fairly anti-government sentiments in this community. But he said, you know, he'd go up into this community with a brush rig and he'd be talking to them. He'd be kind of making this face-to-face contact with one citizen about mitigation, and not only was that effective, but this citizen was like, hey, let me call my friend Fred, and then Fred's going to call his friend Denise, and then sooner or later we have 6 people lining up saying, hey, teach me about mitigation, help me mitigate. So we're seeing kind of that prominence of face-to-face contact as being a really important way to outreach about wildfire mitigation. So for our second research question, I'm going to turn it back over to Adrian. Thank you. So another one of our major research questions is about risk assessment. We wanted to understand, you know, first of all, how wildfire risk is being assessed and communicated in the WUI, and then secondly, with like what effects. So risk assessment, I should probably define, it's essentially the process of WUI resident kind of going through an individualized analysis of the level of wildfire risk on their property. These risk analyses are typically conducted by natural resource managers, and they usually involve some kind of like reporting back to you about what your risk level is. That data can be communicated to the individual in a number of different ways. It can be, it can kind of come to you in the form of like a color-coded scale, so you're somewhere from green to red, or maybe a numerical scale where you're somewhere on a scale from, say, 1 to 10. And it can also be communicated either publicly, so say, on a public map that's posted to the web for all to see, or privately, by a password-protected website or email or in a letter. So we heard a lot about risk assessment from our focus group, and we wanted to learn more. So when we conducted our survey, we asked resource managers, first of all, whether they perform risk assessment or not. We found this broke down sort of half and half. Half of our resource managers either were not performing risk assessments or were referring residents of the WUI somewhere else for their risk assessments. The other half of resource managers that answered our survey said they were doing risk assessment. So we then asked them a couple of follow-up questions to figure out sort of how they operationalize these risk assessments. Now they're allowed to select all that apply amongst the categories in this graph, and I've then sort of color-coded them a little bit for comparative purposes, but don't drive yourself crazy trying to get this to add up to 100%, because since they could select as many things as they wanted, these categories do not add up to 100%, they add up to a lot more. So kind of moving left to right here, of those who said they're performing risk assessment, about 40% said they're assessing all of the properties within the WUIs in which they work. A larger percentage, 80%, said that they assess properties when asked. Now that 80% might incorporate some of that 40%. We can't know for sure. And then it breaks down sort of half and half, about 20% and 20%, between whether they communicate that data publicly or they keep that data private. And then when it comes to the actual reporting style, there's kind of a slight preference toward this color-coded metric versus maybe like a numerical scale. So you can see that there's like a lot of variation in whether risk assessment's being performed, and then when it is performed, how it's being done. When we dig into that variety a little bit more, we also find a lot of variety in perceptions of risk assessment. So first of all, when you ask resource managers how perceptive they think WUI residents are to risk assessment practices, they overwhelmingly, 84%, say that they find WUI residents to be incredibly receptive to risk assessment. Really small percentages say either unreceptive or neutral. But when you talk to actual WUI residents about risk assessment, as we did during our focus groups, you get a much more mixed up picture. So in Colorado Springs, the top quote here, we found that WUI residents were A, very welcoming of risk assessment, and B, deeply affected by it. So in Colorado Springs, the city fire department has assessed wildfire risk throughout the WUI and then produced a big public color-coded map. And that document's become incredibly important there. So important that some communities, as you can see in this top quote, or some neighborhoods are posting that map on their entry gates. We saw pretty much the opposite in the Fort Collins WUI, however. Risk assessment by any government entity there was such a non-starter that even volunteer firefighters didn't want their colleagues coming to assess their property. So this quote here reads, there are like 10 or 12 residents up there who are on our department as volunteers, and they didn't want us up there at all. It gets even more interesting when you ask resource managers what sort of risk assessment they would do if they were hampered by nothing, if they had no constraints, if this were their perfect world and they had unlimited resources, what would they do in terms of risk assessment? So 67% said that they would perform risk assessments for all properties in the WUI, and they would make that data totally public. Another 20% said that they would assess risk for all properties in the WUI, but then keep that data private. So together you have about 87% of resource managers responding to our survey saying that they wish they could perform risk assessment in one way or another for all the properties in their WUI. So why is it then that we're only seeing half of the resource managers we heard from saying that they're actually doing it? Again, probably signaling a resource constraint here, but also this probably links up to these sort of mixed attitudes and receptivity by WUI residents to these risk assessment practices. So pausing here just for a minute to kind of recap. What we're generally seeing from our qualitative and quantitative data is this dynamic that when it comes to the collective action problem that is wildfire risk mitigation in the WUI, resource managers, residents, and NGOs are reporting that the more traditional, formal, heavy-handed approaches to wildfire risk mitigation aren't totally effective. By that I mean ordinances, regulations, fees, taxes are just not the top choice for resource managers or for residents. And that even risk assessment by government agencies is kind of tricky. There's mixed execution, mixed receptivity, and they're likely hampered by resource constraints as well. The good news, though, is that it really seems that these informal approaches can provide kind of added leverage where there's little traction along more traditional paths. So in terms of these informal governance efforts, what our survey respondents and residents and NGOs are reporting to be really effective are these face-to-face communication efforts with WUI residents, sort of practice of trying to turn personal experience in the form of close calls into actual mitigation on the ground, encouraging the writing of community wildfire protection plans, and really promoting these sort of citizen-to-citizen networks of mitigation activity. So, all of that said, I mean, sort of knowing that, it'd be really easy, or it'd really nice to know sort of which resource managers prefer which of these styles, right? So which resource managers kind of lean toward more of these formal governance efforts and which resource managers would prefer some of these informal styles. We've been tinkering around with our survey data to try to kind of model for that. Deserai has been. And when Deserai was modeling for the more sort of informal approach to governance, the data was kind of fuzzy, but she got a much clearer picture from the modeling of these the resource managers that are much more likely to use these more formal approaches. And so she's going to chat about that now. Thank you.
Sorry. All right, so like Adrienne said, we're curious what characteristics of one of these wildfire professionals makes them more likely to support government regulation. And so what we did from our survey data, we asked a number of questions about opinions and preferences for types of mitigation, like both Elizabeth and Adrienne talked about, the incentives, grants available for wildfire mitigation on private property, or the more top-down regulatory approaches. And what we did is we created two additive variables. One that added all of the scores associated with support for the incentive-based approaches, and then one for the questions that focused on government regulatory approaches. So the first thing that we find, and the most important thing from this correlation is simply that that there is a correlation between the jurisdiction that a fire professional works in and their support for these more regulatory approaches. Specifically, those fire managers who work at the federal level are more likely to support regulatory approaches. So, so this makes some sense. They probably have less distrust for higher levels of government and higher levels of government regulation and taxation and so forth. And since that's their professional background. Don't expect you to read all of this. I'm going to highlight a few things, but what we did is we created a linear regression model that tried to understand what characteristics of what these wildfire professionals predict that they support government regulation. The things theoretically that we would expect are that like a lot of psychology literature would suggest that if something's happening closer to you, if your WUI has greater risk or has seen greater development, if you have higher levels of recent wildfires in your WUI, you might be more concerned about these and more willing to allow government regulation. Perhaps the state that you work in or the number of years you've worked in fire would predict these things. But I'm going to highlight the ones that actually showed significance. The first is the state that with New Mexico, Montana, and Washington predicting higher levels of support, but that's not really, I think that has to do probably more with our sample size from those states than anything else. Interestingly, those who spend more time in their own personal professional lives physically doing mitigation activities each week are the ones who support government regulation. So they're out there like with their axe and their chainsaws, annoyed at people probably for not mitigating, thinking that we need more government regulation or so forth. So what they do in their own jobs. But the opposite is not true. We also asked the converse, how much of your time do you spend in education and outreach each week? And that was not significant. It was the mitigation activities. Then we asked, in terms of opinions, we asked a question that, I forget exactly how it was worded, but something, it was a Likert scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree about climate change is making wildfire risk in the WUI worse. We also asked, normal cycles of drought are making it worse. We also asked whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement that that fire is healthy for an ecosystem. And so there was actually not a significance in this model with the climate change statement, and also not with the proximity with that. Like I said, we would expect people who have more wildfire risk near them, see it in their personal lives, to be more concerned. Both of these, while not significant, the non-significance of it was interesting to us, because a lot of these have become very political, hot button beliefs, aspects of belief systems. And so the fact that this climate change statement was not significant there was interesting to us, as well as that proximity. And then finally, in terms of the demographics, those fire professionals who have worked in wildfire response and mitigation for longer support greater levels of government regulation. So that was interesting. And also, because we're asking broadly about the role of government, the appropriate role of government, we certainly wanted to include political affiliation there, and it's not significant. So really the things here that are the most important that we saw is someone's own experience mitigating for fire in their profession and the number of years that they've worked in wildfire are those that predict that these wildfire professionals are going to support more traditional regulatory approaches instead of those incentive-based approaches. So we're still working through this data here and working on a paper for Santa Barbara. So this is kind of our first stab at this modeling. And so Elizabeth is going to take over again. Back over. Thank you. All right. So we've been talking about knowing that from our interviews with fire professionals, from some of our survey results, from our interviews with focus groups, that a lot of people prefer these more informal methods. Yet we are not able to totally tell who's using these informal methods. We're having a much clearer picture when we look at who's using the more formal methods. And so we wanted to kind of investigate why this is. And we know that even if wildfire resource professionals know that these informal methods are more effective or residents are more receptive to them, that they're not easy to implement. They're not simple. They're not foolproof. So what might be some things that are holding wildfire professionals back from using kind of these informal methods? And then at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'm going to bring up resources one more time. So we see some resource issues. These informal methods take a lot of resources. We've had residents tell us, someone coming and sitting down at your house, looking at your property, talking about what changes to make. That's what actually gets major amounts of work done. That's what also takes major amounts of fire professionals' times. Also, we heard from residents, these people that are fire professionals do a great job at this. The State Forest Service, they have 5 or 6 employees, but 6 people can't go door to door and assess every property in the WUI. So we're seeing some constraints there that might lead fire professionals to say, I think these informal methods are really working, but I'm not really going to be able to use them. Another reason is anti-government attitudes. So even when fire professionals say, hi, I'm here to help, I want to kind of work with you to build these incentives, people don't necessarily believe that when they're coming kind of from the government side. Our other focus groups said, they didn't even want a whiff of government around, regardless of what the government was trying to do. A third constraint is that we know this close call idea works for some people and motivates them to mitigate, but there's some issues there. For instance, in this quote from one of our focus group participants, she said, it only took one fire and then we started mitigating, we started cutting down trees, we started raking up the pine needles. But what happens when that one fire is the wildfire that burns down your house? Can we really rely on this personal experience to be a good way to help people learn about wildfire if they're in a high-risk zone for wildfire?
We also have seen it backfire with many of our residents, knowing that, oh, we didn't mitigate, but this fire already happened, and we're safe now. We're totally out of the red zone because, this fire already happened in our area, and we're not going to get another one soon. So it's hard to use some of these more informal methods with people that have reacted like this, and really make that effective in communities. And then finally, another constraint can be a window of opportunity to use these informal methods. So just when you can actually implement them. We heard across our cases that we usually only have a window of opportunity after a catastrophe that's less than a year when people are willing to actually listen to you. This is also the same time that fire professionals are dealing with the fallout of the wildfire, and so they don't have enough resources or people to actually go out and work on kind of getting people to mitigate based on fear of a wildfire at that time when it's still salient in their minds. We heard again, this is a quote from one of our watershed interviews, we have that year that we can motivate people based on fear, but once that year's up, you need to start working with other reasons to do mitigation work. You need to talk about the wildlife values, you need to talk about the watershed values, those kind of things. And traditional wildfire agencies may not have the flexibility to evolve their kind of messages to match these different dynamics. So we have all these constraints to informal governance, but we know that some of these informal methods are working. So just to start wrapping up, we wanted to look into some ways that we can overcome these constraints. So our first way to really overcome these constraints is to really capitalize on collaboration with citizen entrepreneurs. We know that only 38% of our survey respondents report using citizen-to-citizen networks often, but we heard from our focus group residents and from other wildfire professionals on the ground that these citizen-to-citizen methods are highly effective. So in Colorado Springs, the fire department's actually deputized a bunch of really motivated individuals. They call them neighborhood champions, and they go out and they get everyone really motivated, and they march down the streets, and they get the Boy Scouts to help them and all that sort of thing. And we've seen Colorado Springs residents just talk over and over and over again about how effective these people are at getting the whole communities to mitigate. They can knock on doors, they can help write wildfire protection plans, they can help apply for grants, link up with NGOs, those kind of things. So there's a lot of room here for these citizen entrepreneurs and their relationships to wildfire agencies to do a lot of good work. This first quote about citizen entrepreneurs is from a really small community kind of up further outside of the Colorado Springs area where this practice hasn't been as institutionalized. But even they're saying, there's some real spark plugs. Sometimes it's just one or two people who are willing to take that and really carry it forward for a community. So we know that it works both when the Colorado Springs Fire Department targets people, but also in these kind of small communities when it comes up a little bit more organically. A second way to overcome some of these constraints is to really capitalize on collaboration with NGOs. And this is coming out of a lot of our new work on how watershed groups can be integrated into fire planning. And we know that in our case study areas, both of our case study areas have a watershed group that has a significant role in fire mitigation. Not all watershed groups work on fire mitigation, but we have at least one in each of our case studies that does. And these NGOs, some things that they've told us, they're a planning and coordination hub. They can pull resources from all different places. They can help to provide additional staff to state and federal partners. They can kind of collectively work to bolster these approaches, and they can work across jurisdictions. So as Adrienne mentioned, wildfire and hydrologic processes don't really obey the jurisdictions that we create that often wildfire professionals must work in. NGOs have more flexibility there. They also have more flexibility to cobble together a variety of grant funds. They can apply for things that fire agencies might not be able to apply for on their own. A couple of other things too, these windows of opportunity that I mentioned, this is a great time where these groups can kind of jump in. They're not the ones always dealing with the fallout of fire, so they can capitalize on that message of getting people to mitigate when it's fresh in their minds. They can also have a little bit more flexibility in changing their message, so it's not necessarily as strict as it would be for a fire agency to mitigate wildfire based on protecting property. And then finally, they're not the government, which is really helpful in a lot of our cases where we saw these anti-government attitudes. When someone from an NGO comes to your door and says, hey, I want to help you mitigate, this might be a little bit more accepted by some of our residents. So before I pass this over to Adrian, just to wrap up some conclusions, we just see that there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration in these informal efforts, and they can really leverage the more formal efforts, and both citizens and NGOs have a really important role to play here. So just to kind of summarize, our efforts to really find the biggest bang for resource managers' limited bucks have really led us in this more sort of outreach and education-based direction and away from sort of more formal regulatory efforts. And according to the resource managers, residents, and NGOs that we talked with and that we surveyed, when resource managers have success, those successes really seem to largely be based on personal connections, linking people to each other and to resources, encouraging local planning, and appealing to complicated and evolving value sets. The successes that resource managers are having also seem to really be collaborative in nature. As Elizabeth was just saying, these citizen entrepreneurs and NGOs, especially watershed groups, have some really important roles to play in amplifying and extending agency efforts. But given that, despite the effectiveness of all those collaborative efforts, we're hearing from people that we interviewed that these collaborative efforts are still really in their infancy in a lot of places in Colorado and in the WUIs of the American West. We don't think that resident resource managers are fully leveraging citizen entrepreneurs in the way that they could in every place, or these relationships with NGOs. So we think there's a lot of room for progress there and a lot of room for future research as well. And on that note, we're going to be heading up to this watershed conference next week, where we hope to learn a lot more from practitioners about these multi-jurisdictional collaborative efforts and the role of watershed groups in this risk mitigation picture. We're also planning to dive a little further into our survey data to do some additional analysis and modeling. A few of the things we're really interested in. We're interested in resource managers' perceptions of the causes of wildfire and the characteristics of their WUI, as Deserai was getting into a little bit, as well as their attitudes toward responsibility for mitigation, and then the connections between those perceptions and attitudes and their approaches to mitigation in general. So perhaps we'll be back sometime in the future to talk to you more about that, but for now, we would love to take any of your questions and talk about what we presented here today.
Super interesting talk. Thank you so much. I just want to mention one idea for future work. I've done some work with municipalities in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, asking questions about their responses to all sorts of different hazards. That's kind of a preliminary thing. And one interesting difference between Colorado and Utah is the degree to which collaborative relationships are cited as a reason for the community doing work like this. So Utah has this incredibly, there's a couple different things going on. There's a strong influence of the Mormon religion there, which promotes a lot of community collaboration. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is CERT, these CERT, community, I forget what it stands for, but emergency response. Yes, those that are so prevalent in Utah and the work in the data we got compared to Colorado. So I just was going to mention it because of an interesting comparison for the future, that you expand and say, well, what's going on in Utah compared to Colorado, that these groups are so much more effective there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, Roger.
So how effective is wildfire mitigation in general? So if you had the Colorado Springs community and it was 100% wildfire mitigated versus how it was, what would be the difference in terms of loss of life or property damage, or do you know that?
Because it's hard to have kind of controls in this situation, the fire professionals generally put it, I forget the exact quotation that we use, but they put it in terms of it increases your odds. But that's a tough thing to communicate to residents because you're trying to convince them to do something and spend a lot of money and spend a lot of time. And they may see, for example, in the Waldo Canyon fire, one of the most mitigated homes in all of Colorado Springs that the fire department would take tours past burned. And so it really is a matter of increasing your odds, right? And so have you guys seen any? I haven't seen any specific quantitative data on that, but the fire managers we've talked to just try to focus on increasing your odds.
Yeah, and definitely feed back into those collective action dynamics, because sort of one thing to just mitigate your own property. It's another thing for your whole neighborhood to do it. That increases your odds in a lot of ways. But then at the end of the day, fires, they might still rip through anyway. But yeah, it was all about, everyone was talking about just shifting the odds.
And one additional thing, a lot of our watershed groups are not focusing on creating things like defensible space around your home. They're working more on a larger scale, so large-scale cuts and things like that. And they've basically been saying that, this defensible space is helpful, and it's especially helpful if all of your neighbors do it too, but it's a matter of increasing your odds, whereas bigger scale mitigation that they might be able to do is really about changing fire behavior. So when we see how that kind of fits in, we might have a better idea of how much it will actually change their odds.
That's a good point.
Yeah, just one last thought that popped in my head is sometimes the things the Forest Service have to do is because of public perception. I mean, on the other direction of what sort of like the public expects something to be happening at this interface where there's all this risk. But again, like you're just saying, I mean, maybe it doesn't actually matter. They have to be seen to be proactive. So there's a tension because, I mean, I'd rather have the community groups and NGOs do all this community-based space because there's something going on, changing the odds, and the Forest Service people actually working on these other things that might be more effective. So, but again, the perception from the public of being seen to be doing something might be another reason why people feel like they have to invest this time, even if it's maybe not expected.
That's a good point. And I mean, the Forest Service is such an interesting entity because, of course, they've had their budget rated more than any other agency for just simply the response part of their mission. And so you see, like in the Pike down near the Waldo Canyon burn area, where managers would say, we would love to be able to do this, but we have something like 100,000 acres to mitigate of our own. We can't really go out and we don't have the resources to go and help. If someone comes to us, we will send them all the resources and help them where we can, but they are such a cash-strapped and resource-strapped agency right now. That's a really good point.
And some of the watershed groups that we talked with are really trying to target that. They're trying to say, like, okay, where is the Forest Service doing a big project, and then how do we link that up with smaller projects that are nearby and kind of bridging those efforts.
It's one of the interesting things about doing this survey is, obviously fire professionals know far more about this issue in depth than we ever will, but because they are so constrained in terms of resources, in terms of just their time, they're fighting more fires, they're constantly either in response mode or in that kind of, post-disaster kind of, I guess you might say, kind of like recovery internally for the agency. They don't often have the time or resources to reach out to one another and find out what's working best in Montana, what's working. So that's one of the things we're hoping when we dig into the survey data a bit deeper to figure out differences between states. Are there certain things that Montana's doing that Wyoming's not doing, that those types of things, because hopefully that type of information could be really useful to people out there actually trying to cope with these limited resources. Other questions? All right.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. And here are some flyers for the rest of the seminar series for this semester. So come pick one up if you would like.
And the next one is next week, October 6th.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so much.